What do you say when someone asks, "How do you keep going after everything?" Keanu Reeves froze. For a moment, the studio went silent. No scripts, no camera smile. Just a man on the edge of something unspeakable. Then he whispered 5 words, and Joe Rogan's eyes filled with tears. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The red recording light blinked softly inside the Austin studio. The air was still, heavy with the familiar scent of old leather, coffee, and soundproof foam. Joe Rogan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his headphones with one hand, the other resting lightly on a stack of interview notes. Across from him sat Keanu Reeves, dressed in his usual black t-shirt and jeans. His hair fell just past his shoulders, a little tousled but clean, like he'd rolled out of bed, splashed water on his face and driven here in silence. He looked comfortable, but not relaxed. Calm, but not light. There was always a weight to Keanu, a presence that made silence feel less like an absence of sound and more like an atmosphere. They had been talking for a while, the usual podcast rhythm, conversations about new projects, training for action scenes, motorcycle rebuilds, and favorite books. Keanu had smiled here and there, let out a soft laugh once or twice, but nothing out of the ordinary. Joe was good at what he did. He knew when a conversation was just surface level and when it started to press against something deeper. He glanced at his notes, tapped the edge of the paper once, then looked up. "Can I ask you something a little heavier?" Joe said. Keanu tilted his head just slightly, as if bracing for it, but nodded. Joe leaned forward. Not in a dramatic way, just a small shift. A man ready to listen more than speak. "With everything you've been through," Joe said carefully, "the tragedies, the losses, the setbacks that would break most people, how do you keep going?" There was a stillness then. It was subtle, but it landed hard. Keanu didn't respond right away. His face didn't show confusion. It showed recognition. Like he'd been waiting for this question. Like it had already been asked 1,000 times in his own mind, but never quite this directly, never in this setting. Joe noticed the change instantly. He'd seen it before, in veterans, in comedians who hid pain behind laughter, in fighters moments before tears. Keanu looked down, hands resting on his knees, thumbs pressed together as if measuring his breath. Then he looked back up at Joe, and then away again, toward the edge of the studio wall lined with fight posters and sound dampeners and signed gloves in glass frames. The silence grew thick, not awkward, not staged, just real. Joe let it sit. No rush, no interruption. He knew that sometimes the moment needed to stretch in order to breathe. Finally, Keanu opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes were focused now, not on Joe, not on the room, on something else, something far behind them both. "That's," Keanu said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "That's a hard one." Joe didn't speak. He simply nodded once, giving space. Because in that moment, everyone listening understood. This wasn't going to be just another conversation. This was the beginning of something else. Something deeper. Something real. Something that would change everything. The room felt heavier now, as if the oxygen had thickened. Joe sat quietly, eyes on Keanu, hands folded loosely in front of the microphone. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't leaning back or easing into a casual joke to break the tension. He stayed where he was, still, focused. Keanu took a slow breath. "You know," he said, "I've answered variations of that question before. In interviews, on red carpets, late-night shows." He paused, staring down at the table. "But those moments, they're scripted." "You know what I mean?" Joe nodded. He did. "There's always a certain answer expected. Something about gratitude, perspective, staying grounded. I've said those things. They're not lies. They're just incomplete. Another pause. Keanu's fingers tapped once on the wood surface of the table, then went still again. But when you ask it like that, he continued, his voice slightly rougher now, when you ask how I keep going, after everything, he trailed off. The silence didn't feel like a stall anymore. It felt like a doorway. Joe leaned in slightly, just enough to show he was there, listening, but not pushing. Keanu finally looked up. I think about that question more than people would guess, he said. I've lived with it, carried it. Some days it's quiet, some days it's loud, but it's always there. Joe waited, letting the moment settle, letting Keanu decide how much of himself to reveal. Keanu's eyes drifted again, not nervously, thoughtfully, like he was walking through a memory, one step at a time. I think the reason that question hit me just now is because I'm not sure I have an answer that's easy, or clean, or comforting. He paused again, but I'll try. And with that, Joe sat back just slightly, knowing instinctively that Keanu was about to go somewhere he hadn't gone publicly before. People know some of it, Keanu said, his tone quieter now. They know about River Phoenix, about Ava, my daughter, about Jennifer, about my dad. Joe nodded again, softly, his face open, present, understanding. Email no pieces, headlines, moments. Keanu's fingers tightened just slightly on the edge of the table. But there's a difference between knowing what happened and knowing what it did to me. The words landed with force, not because of their volume, but because of the weight behind them. Joe remained silent. Keanu exhaled, slowly. His eyes didn't tear up, but they softened. I think what keeps me going, he said, is complicated, and maybe I've never really said it out loud. Not the real version. He looked directly at Joe then, not through him, into him. So, maybe it's time I try. And in that moment, every listener, in the studio, at home, across the world, leaned in just a little closer. Not for the celebrity, not for the fame, but for the human being behind it. Because something was breaking open, and nobody knew what would come out. Keanu sat back slightly, not in retreat, but in preparation. He looked toward the wall again, the one decorated with autographed gloves and framed photos of UFC champions. It was a wall meant to showcase strength, physical power. But right now, it looked out of place, like it didn't belong in the same room where a man was quietly deciding whether to reveal the most vulnerable parts of his soul. There was a time, Keanu began, when I thought keeping it together meant not talking about certain things. That strength was just about carrying on, quietly, without bothering anyone. Joe's brow furrowed slightly, listening more with his eyes than his ears. I told myself I had to be the one who didn't make it worse for others, that my pain was mine to manage, mine to bury. He stopped, breathed again. I was wrong. That sentence hung in the room, like a truth long overdue. Survive the day, Keanu said, where the act of waking up felt unbearable, where brushing my teeth felt pointless, where I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize the person staring back. Joe didn't interrupt. He didn't shift in his seat. He let the stillness do the talking. And then, Keanu said softly, there was one night I planned to stop pretending. Joe's expression shifted. Concern flickered in his eyes. I had everything written, everything arranged. I thought I was being considerate. I thought I was solving a problem. Keanu looked down again, then lifted his eyes back toward Joe. But something happened that night. Something small, unplanned, unexpected. His voice caught slightly, and it changed everything. Joe leaned forward but still didn't speak. It's strange, Keanu said, how one tiny interruption, one unexpected knock on the door of your plans can make the whole thing unravel. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gravity, his breath held, of the ache that lives just beneath the surface in so many lives. Joe nodded slowly, not prompting, not prodding, just being there. And Keanu, for the first time in the entire conversation, gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's why your question hit me so hard," he said. "Because I've asked it too, of myself, in the dark, at 2 a.m. Alone." He paused again. "But no one's ever asked me like that, like they really wanted to hear the answer." Joe's voice, quiet and steady, finally returned. "I do." And Keanu nodded, once. "Then let's talk about it," he said. And just like that, the floodgates opened. But before the stories began to flow, before the pain and the survival and the light slowly pushing through the cracks, Keanu took one last breath and whispered again, "That's a hard one." And now they were ready to go all the way in, to not look away, to tell the truth. Keanu sat quietly across from Joe, letting the weight of his answer settle. The question Joe had asked still echoed in his ears, but something had shifted now. The studio lights no longer felt staged. The cameras faded into the background. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about honesty. And Keanu knew that to explain what kept him going, he had to start with what nearly broke him. He took a breath. "I've gotten good at answering questions like that," Keanu said. "The kind that come dressed as compliments, but carry something deeper underneath." He glanced at the table between them. "People say I'm resilient, that I'm grounded, that I have grace in the face of loss. And I've learned to nod, to thank them, to give an answer that sounds calm and wise." Joe didn't move, sensing that Keanu was pulling back a curtain. "But most of the time, I was just surviving." Keanu's voice dropped slightly. "I became an expert at giving people what they wanted to hear, especially when they were trying to be kind. The red carpets, the interviews. I knew how to make it all seem easy." He closed his eyes briefly, remembering. "There were nights I'd walk into a movie premiere, smile for photos, answer the same 5 questions in a row, then go back to the hotel and sit in the dark for hours." He paused. No music, no TV, just silence. Joe nodded once, not as a prompt, just in solidarity. "I didn't want people to worry," Keanu said. "I didn't want to be a burden, so I got good at wearing the mask, the kind smile, the thoughtful answers." He looked up, but that mask got heavy. The room stayed still. "There's a clip from an interview I did years ago," Keanu continued, "right after the third Matrix film. I was asked about the loss of my daughter, about grief, and I remember giving this neat, controlled answer, something like, 'Grief changes shape, but it never ends.' It went viral. People said it was wise." He paused again, then smiled faintly. It was rehearsed. Joe blinked but didn't interrupt. "I'd practiced that line, memorized it, so when the moment came, I didn't have to feel anything. I could just perform grief. Presentable, polished, digestible." Keanu looked down at his hands again. "I've done that so many times I lost count. I thought it was strength. I really did. I thought that by holding it in, by staying calm, I was doing everyone a favor." He shook his head slowly. "But inside, I was unraveling." The admission filled the room. Keanu looked back up. "And the more praise I got for being composed, the more isolated I felt. Because nobody knew what was really going on." He swallowed hard. "And I didn't know how to tell them." Joe sat forward slightly now, not to pressure Keanu, but as if leaning closer might help him carry some of the weight being shared. "I remember once," Keanu said softly, "at a fan event in Tokyo. It was a long trip. I hadn't been sleeping. I was still dealing with the aftermath of some things." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. There were hundreds of people waiting, cameras flashing, people cheering, calling my name. I smiled. I waved. I said all the right things. He paused, as if watching the memory play out again in front of him. And then I went back to the hotel, sat on the edge of the bed, and just stared at the wall for 6 hours. Joe didn't speak. His face said enough. Everyone thought I was strong, Keanu continued, that I was handling everything with grace. And I let them think that, because honestly, I didn't want to disappoint anyone. He took a breath, steady and slow. But the truth is, I was barely holding it together. Keanu looked down at the floor, like the words were sinking deeper now. There was a premiere in Los Angeles a few years after that. I was walking the carpet, fans were cheering, reporters shouting questions, and I was smiling, laughing, posing. He closed his eyes, and I remember thinking to myself, "You're dying inside, and no one can tell." The words came out low and flat, but full of something that felt close to grief. I wasn't on drugs, I wasn't drinking, I wasn't lashing out, but inside, it felt like I was disappearing. Joe leaned in, elbows on the table now, his eyes locked on Keanu. "Sometimes I'd walk through a crowd," Keanu said, "with cameras flashing and people reaching out to touch me, and I'd feel like I wasn't really there, like I'd become this image people wanted, and the real me was just gone." He paused, his throat tight. "There's a loneliness in that, a strange kind of loneliness. Being surrounded by people who adore you, who celebrate you, and still feeling like no one sees you." Keanu lifted his hand, then let it fall to the table. I think that's when it started to sink in. That what people loved wasn't actually me. It was the mask, the performance, the story they told themselves about me. Joe's voice, quiet and even, finally returned. "When did you realize that?" Keanu looked at him and for a moment said nothing. "Too late," he whispered. Another pause. "By the time I realized how far gone I was, I didn't know how to come back." He leaned forward slightly. "And the worst part was, nobody noticed. Because I had trained them not to." The words hit hard. Joe didn't try to soften them. He just listened. Because sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let the silence hold what words can't. Keanu exhaled slowly, the weight of memory still pressing against his chest. "There was one time," he said, "when I was standing backstage at an award show, moments away from going on. I was holding a trophy. They just announced my name. People were clapping. I was about to walk out into a sea of flashing lights." He looked down, jaw tight. "And all I could think was, I hope no one can tell. I'm empty." Joe didn't flinch. "I walked out. I smiled. I thanked people. I gave a speech about gratitude and the gift of storytelling, and then I went back to my seat and sat there, barely hearing anything around me." Keanu's eyes were distant now. "It wasn't always like that. There were times in my life when I felt connected, when the applause meant something, when the lights felt warm instead of blinding. But at some point, that changed." He folded his hands together, resting them gently on the table. "And I didn't notice the change right away. It crept in, quietly, until one day I realized I didn't feel anything anymore. Not sadness, not joy, just numb." Joe looked at him, eyes filled with empathy, not pity. "Did anyone close to you see it?" he asked gently. Keanu shook his head. "I think some suspected, maybe they saw flashes of it. But I was always the guy who handled things. The quiet one, the dependable one. The one who didn't complain." He looked up. "That became my identity, and it trapped me." Joe nodded, understanding more than he said. "I thought if I ever admitted how bad it had gotten," Keanu said, "people would stop trusting me, stop believing in me. I didn't want to be seen as broken." He glanced at the mic in front of him. "But the irony is, pretending I was okay broke me faster than the grief ever could." The studio was still. Keanu's voice dropped lower now, calm but raw. "You can only carry so much alone, and for a long time I thought that was noble. I thought I was protecting others from my pain. But what I was really doing was disappearing piece by piece. Joe leaned forward again, his voice soft but steady. And now? Keanu gave a long pause. I'm learning, he said. The two words carried decades of weight. To let people see behind the smile, to be honest when things feel heavy, to stop performing strength and start practicing it. Joe gave him a small nod. Because real strength, Keanu said, isn't about holding it all in. It's about knowing when it's time to let some of it out. And with that, the mask cracked. Not shattered, not destroyed, but open just enough for the world to finally see the man beneath it. Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair. His voice remained steady, but his eyes had drifted to a place far from the studio. The name Joe had heard only briefly, Ava, seemed to hang in the air, though neither man had spoken it again. The silence was thick. Keanu let it breathe. Who was 2005, he said finally. The year after the last Matrix film came out. He looked toward the ceiling, not searching for words, but measuring the distance between then and now. On paper, everything looked perfect. I had money, I had recognition, I had freedom. But inside, I was lost. He paused, then added quietly, maybe more lost than I've ever been. Joe nodded once, letting him go on. I had this house in the hills. Big windows, open floor plan, minimalist design. People told me it was beautiful. I had it designed that way, intentionally, hoping the clean space would help my mind feel less chaotic. Keanu looked down, but it didn't. The words came slowly. It started to feel like a glass box. Quiet, controlled, and completely empty. He tapped the table once, then stilled his hand. There was a stretch of days, maybe weeks, where I don't think I said a single word to another person. I'd wake up, walk to the kitchen, make coffee, and then just exist. Sit on the couch, stare at the trees outside, watch the sunlight move across the floor. He let out a breath, not heavy, but worn. People think grief is always loud, that it's crying in the shower or screaming into pillows. But sometimes grief is just silence. Joe listened, unmoving. I would walk through the house and avoid certain rooms. Her room, Ava's. Even though she never got to live there, I had set aside a room for her. I had painted the walls a soft lavender. I had picked out a rocking chair. His voice wavered but did not break. I never sat in that chair. Keanu looked down again, eyes focused on the wood grain of the table. After we lost her, and then after losing Jennifer not long after, I think a part of me shut off permanently. I stopped planning things. I stopped expecting anything from life. I just existed. Joe exhaled quietly, the only sound in the studio besides the hum of distant lights. There were days I didn't know what time it was. I didn't care. The sun would rise and then it would set, and I'd be in the same spot. Not sad, not angry, just nothing. Keanu turned slightly, his eyes meeting Joe's. That's when I realized something that scared me. He paused, voice low. I couldn't remember the last time I felt joy. And just like that, the center of his pain revealed itself. Keanu's voice softened even more as he continued. I think joy disappears long before you notice it's gone. It slips out quietly. You keep functioning, you keep doing the things you've always done, but one day, you realize it's not there anymore. He paused, his fingers gently pressing together. There was this moment, he said, on a Sunday afternoon. I had nothing to do, which wasn't unusual back then. No shoot, no press, just an empty day in a quiet house. He looked at Joe, eyes searching. I remember sitting on the floor in the living room, reading the back of a cereal box. Not because I was hungry, but because it was the only thing with words nearby. The silence was so loud, I needed something to read. Anything to distract my mind. Keanu looked away, almost embarrassed. That's when I knew I wasn't okay, when cereal became my company. Joe nodded slowly, understanding more with each word. I had photos on the wall, Keanu said. From old sets, moments with friends, a few pictures of river. But they stopped feeling like memories. They started feeling like reminders of things I'd lost. He reached up, rubbing the side of his neck, as if the weight of those days had never quite left. There was a picture of him, River, taken in 1992, the summer before he died. He was smiling, arms around me. We'd just finished a hike. That picture used to make me smile. But in 2005, I couldn't even look at it without feeling hollow. Joe didn't say a word. The quiet let the meaning hit harder. And Ava? Keanu's voice trailed off, throat tightening. There's no picture of her, no memory to hold on to, just the ache of what never was. He let that sit for a moment. You lose someone before they're born, and the world moves on like nothing happened. You don't get casseroles or condolences, you get silence. Like the pain doesn't count. Joe exhaled through his nose, jaw set. I started walking the halls of that house like a ghost, Keanu said, moving from room to room, never turning on lights, barely eating, just walking, circling, waiting for time to pass. He glanced at Joe again, and the worst part was, nobody noticed, because I had trained them not to. Joe nodded slowly. You kept performing. Keanu gave a faint smile. Exactly. I kept showing up, I kept doing interviews, I kept acting. People would say, "You're so humble, so grounded," and I'd smile and say, "Thank you." But inside, he stopped, closing his eyes briefly. Inside, I was buried. And that word hung there, heavier than grief. Buried. Alive, but hidden beneath a mountain of silence, loss, and unspoken pain. Keanu took another breath, this one slower, more deliberate. There was a day, he said, when I opened my front door and couldn't remember why. He looked over at Joe, hands flat on the table now. I just stood there, holding the handle, looking out at the street. I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't have anywhere to be. I think I just wanted air. He paused, but I couldn't step outside. Joe tilted his head, listening closely. I was afraid, Keanu said. Not of people, not of the world. I was afraid that I'd walk out there and still feel nothing. That I'd breathe in the fresh air, see the trees, hear the birds, and it wouldn't mean anything. He shook his head slightly. When you stop feeling joy, everything becomes a test. Every small thing becomes a chance to prove to yourself that you're still human, that you still care. And when the feelings don't come, it's terrifying. Joe nodded, his expression serious. I sat back down on the couch and just stared at the door, Keanu continued. That door became a symbol, a question I couldn't answer. Would walking through it make a difference? Or would the world outside be just as silent as the world inside? He looked away. I think that was the day I realized how far I'd fallen. Joe leaned forward just slightly, the only movement he made. And yet, he said gently, you kept going. Keanu let out a breath. Barely. I told myself I was surviving. But survival without feeling isn't life. It's maintenance. He glanced around the room, then settled his gaze back on Joe. I started thinking in numbers. How many days since I last smiled genuinely? How many nights I'd gone without speaking? How many meals I'd skipped? It wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about statistics, data. It was easier than facing the truth. Joe said nothing, letting the weight of Keanu's confession fill the space. There was a small cabinet in my hallway, Keanu said. Inside were all the letters I hadn't mailed. Letters to Ava, to Jennifer, to River. Pages and pages of things I couldn't say to anyone alive. He paused, eyes glistening now, though no tears fell. I would open that drawer, read a letter, then close it, like a ritual, like I was keeping them alive in some way. But really, I think I was just avoiding myself. Joe's voice was quiet. Did you want help? Keanu looked at him for a long time. I wanted to deserve help, he said, but I didn't believe I did. The silence that followed was complete. And then Keanu said, more to himself than to Joe, that house was beautiful, but it was a prison. And the hardest part wasn't being alone in it. It was realizing I had built it that way. The honesty cut deep, because grief didn't just happen to Keanu. He had made a home for it and moved in. Keanu looked down at the table, eyes steady, voice quiet. There was a Tuesday in October, he said. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember the way it felt. He glanced up at Joe briefly, then continued. I had nothing scheduled. No press, no filming, no phone calls. Just a day, just time. But it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like weight. He paused, searching for the right words. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days, no texts, no calls. I didn't even turn my phone on. I didn't want to hear from anyone. I didn't want to pretend I was okay. The room was still. Joe remained silent, listening closely. At morning, Keanu said, I made a pot of coffee, not because I wanted coffee, just because it was something to do. I sat in the kitchen and watched the steam rise from the mug. I didn't drink it. He let out a soft breath. The silence in that house had stopped being peaceful a long time ago. It became something else. It pressed on me, wrapped around me like a fog. Keanu looked off, eyes drifting toward memory. I walked around the house barefoot, just drifting, from the hallway to the living room, to the kitchen and back again, over and over, not thinking, not feeling, just moving. Joe's hands were still folded. He didn't blink. I remember looking at the clock at one point, Keanu said. It was 11:17 a.m., and I thought, this day is going to last forever. He paused. Time wasn't real anymore. It was just noise, a number on a wall. Joe's face stayed still, the gravity of the story building with each sentence. I went and sat on the couch. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't pick up a book. I just stared out the window. I watched the trees sway in the breeze. I watched the shadows shift across the floor. Hours passed like that. Keanu's voice grew even softer. And then, without warning, the thought appeared. He took a breath. It didn't come like a cry for help. It didn't scream. It whispered. He looked directly at Joe. It said, "You don't have to do this anymore." Joe's eyes darkened. He understood what that meant. Keanu nodded. That was the first time I truly contemplated ending my life. There was no drama in his tone, just calm. The terrifying calm of someone who had run out of reasons. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel sad. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. A soul-level exhaustion. A weariness that felt permanent. He looked down again. I wasn't thinking about death. I was thinking about stopping. And that distinction was everything. Not escape, not revenge, just surrender. The quietest kind of goodbye. Keanu's hands rested quietly on the table. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't restless. His stillness made his words even more powerful. I didn't plan anything that day, he said. I just thought about it, but not in the way most people imagine. He looked up. There were no tears, no desperation, just this strange clarity, like I was making a list of errands, like I was sorting out a task. Joe leaned in slightly, but still didn't speak. I thought about what people would say, how long it would take for someone to notice, who would find me, what headlines might look like. He let out a quiet breath. It wasn't emotional. It was logistical. He shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. That's the scariest part. It didn't feel like a crisis. It felt like a solution. Joe's expression didn't change, but the air between them had thickened again. I started to write things down. Not a letter exactly, just notes, instructions, thoughts. Keanu stared at the tabletop. I wrote that I was sorry, that it wasn't anyone's fault, that I just didn't see a way forward. He paused again, and then I crossed it out. Not because I changed my mind, but because I didn't want to burden anyone with my apology. Joe closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the truth of that moment. I wasn't trying to make a statement, Keanu said. I wasn't trying to shock anyone. I just wanted to disappear in a way that caused the least amount of pain. He looked up again, eyes clear but heavy. I thought that was compassion. I thought that was kindness. Joe exhaled, quiet and steady. I remember sitting on the floor in the hallway, Keanu continued, my back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of me. The light was fading outside. I could hear the wind through the trees. His voice dropped lower, and for the first time in my life I felt nothing. No hope, no fear, no anger. Just this vast emptiness. Joe didn't interrupt. The story was unfolding exactly as it needed to. I looked down at my hands. I remembered them resting in my lap, and I thought, these hands have held so much, and now they hold nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything unspoken. I stayed like that for hours, Keanu said. Not asleep, not awake, just suspended in that in-between space, waiting for something to tip me one way or the other. Joe finally asked, gently, what stopped you? Keanu looked at him. Nothing, he said. Not yet. And those two words, not yet, carried a chilling honesty. Because in that moment there was no miracle. No sudden reason to live. Just a man standing at the edge of the cliff, still deciding whether to step off. The room stayed silent, letting Keanu's last words echo in the space between them. I didn't move that night, he said. Not really. I think I went into the bedroom around midnight. I lay on top of the covers. I didn't even bother to undress. He paused, voice still low. I stared at the ceiling. I remember counting the lines in the wood. There were 47. I don't know why I counted them. Maybe to give my brain something to do. Maybe to avoid thinking about the real decision. Joe watched him closely, still leaning forward. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just lay there, waiting. He exhaled slowly, waiting for the morning, or for courage, or for nothing. Keanu blinked, slow and steady. That's the thing people don't understand about that kind of darkness. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It tells you it's doing everyone a favor, that your absence will be easier than your presence. He looked directly at Joe. And if you listen long enough, you start to believe it. Joe nodded, his own voice quiet. So what changed? Keanu gave the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Something, eventually, but not that night. He looked away again. That night, I made a mental list. Who I would write to, what I would say, where I would do it, how I would make it look like an accident. Not to deceive people, just to soften the blow. Joe remained completely still. I wasn't thinking like someone in pain, Keanu said. I was thinking like someone solving a problem. His voice didn't shake. That made it harder to hear. Scared me later, how calm I was, how rational it felt. Like checking out of a hotel, like putting away dishes. He swallowed, then added quietly, I even smiled at one point, not because I was happy, but because I thought, at least this will be over soon. Joe's voice returned, softer than before. And yet, here you are. Keanu nodded once. Yeah, here I am. He looked back down at his hands. That night didn't end with a revelation. No light from the sky, no voice in my head. It just ended. He paused. And then the next day began. Joe tilted his head slightly. What was different about that day? Keanu gave a faint, tired laugh. Nothing, at least not at first. He sat up straighter. But something did change eventually. Something small, unplanned, uninvited. Joe's eyes narrowed gently. Sound, a knock, a voice? Keanu nodded. Exactly. He looked at Joe with quiet conviction. Because that's the truth about standing at the edge. It doesn't take a miracle to pull you back. Sometimes it only takes a flicker. Joe waited, sensing they were near the turning point. Keanu whispered the word slowly, and the flicker came, just in time. Keanu's voice lowered as he leaned into the next part of his story. There was no drama in his expression, only a quiet stillness that came from remembering something deeply personal, something he hadn't spoken aloud before. "The next morning I felt different," he said. "Not better, just clearer." He paused, drawing in a shallow breath. It was as if a switch had flipped in my mind. I had made the decision. And that brought a strange kind of peace, not the peacefulness of healing, the peace of certainty. Joe nodded gently, saying nothing. I knew I couldn't do it that day. There were still things I needed to prepare, loose ends, people who deserved something more than silence. Keanu looked down at his hands, then slowly back up. So I started writing. He didn't blink. I sat down at the small desk in my bedroom, the one I never used. I pulled out a stack of blank pages, clean white sheets, no lines. His tone was even, but the tension in his jaw said everything. I started with my sister, Kim. He paused again. She's always been the strongest person I know, even with everything she's endured. The illness, the pain, she never let it harden her. Joe sat quietly, hands still folded on the table. I wanted her to know it wasn't her fault, that none of this was about her. I told her how proud I was of her, how much I admired her strength, how grateful I was for the moments she made me feel seen, even when I was trying to hide. Keanu's voice wavered for the first time. I ended the letter by telling her I hoped she would forgive me, and that if she couldn't, I understood. He looked away briefly, eyes focused on the floor. Next was my mother. He let out a breath. We've had a complicated relationship, a lot of distance, a lot of silence between us. But I never stopped caring, never stopped wishing things had been different. Keanu's fingers touched the edge of the table, holding steady. I wrote that I hoped she would find peace, that maybe my leaving would make space for something new in her life, something lighter. I know that sounds strange, but I honestly believed at the time that my absence might lift a burden. Joe didn't move, letting the heaviness land. I folded both letters and placed them in separate envelopes. No return address, just their names. Keanu's voice dropped lower. And then I wrote a third one. He didn't say the name, not yet. This one was harder, more personal. Someone I hadn't seen in years, someone who meant something, even though we were never close in the way people might expect. He paused. I didn't sign it, I just wrote what I needed to say, then sealed it and put it with the others. His eyes flicked to Joe. It was strange, feeling more organized in that moment than I had in months. I spent the next few hours planning things that most people never think about, Keanu said softly. Not until it's too late. Joe leaned in slightly, sensing the shift in tone. I started making lists, Keanu continued. Bank accounts, legal documents, studio obligations. My will was already in place, but there were details that needed updating. He gave a faint, almost hollow laugh. It's funny what you prioritize when you're preparing to disappear. I didn't think about legacy or headlines. I thought about who would have to clean up. His fingers pressed together tightly. I left instructions for my assistant. Simple things. Where to find the key, what to do with the mail, notes for the housekeeper so she wouldn't be confused. Joe didn't interrupt. The quiet was part of the story now. I even thought about what day of the week would be best. He looked up at Joe. Friday. Joe blinked but said nothing. Friday would give people the weekend, Keanu said. Time to process, time to grieve. I didn't want the news breaking on a Monday and ruining someone's work week. He paused, letting the absurdity of the logic speak for itself. I wasn't trying to make it easier on me. I was trying to make it easier on them. Joe finally asked, gently, Did you believe that would help? Keanu nodded once. At the time, yes. I thought I was being thoughtful, considerate. He let out a soft breath. I wanted to make it as clean as possible. No mess, no confusion, just absence. Joe's expression shifted, concern deepening. The more I planned, Keanu continued, the more relief I felt. It was like checking things off a list. Every decision made, every letter written, made the weight feel lighter. He glanced down at the table. That should have been the warning sign. He looked back up at Joe. When ending your life starts to feel like a series of tasks, like you're managing a project, that's when you know you're deep in it. Not because you're out of control, but because you've convinced yourself you're being rational. Joe nodded slowly, absorbing the words. There was no drama, Keanu said. No panic, just clarity. I knew what I was going to do, I knew when, I knew how. His voice stayed steady, but his hands had started to tighten. I even picked out the clothes. Joe raised his eyes. Black jeans, white shirt, simple, clean. Keanu gave a soft, almost detached smile. I thought it would be easier for whoever found me, nothing messy, no surprises. The air in the studio was still, thick with the gravity of quiet decisions made in isolation. And for a while, Keanu said, I believed I had thought of everything. He looked away, but I hadn't. Keanu's eyes remained fixed on a distant point, somewhere past the edges of the studio walls. There was one more thing I did, he said, something I haven't talked about before. Joe waited patiently. I made playlists. The words were unexpected, but they carried their own kind of weight. I went through my music library and started putting together songs. Not sad songs, not dramatic, just ones that had meant something to me at different points in my life. He paused. I had one list labeled Drive, another called Quiet. One just said Ava. Joe stayed quiet, not needing to ask what was on that last list. I didn't plan to listen to them, Keanu continued. I just wanted them to exist, like small time capsules, like messages I couldn't say out loud. His voice faltered briefly. Description. I don't know what I thought would happen to them. Maybe someone would find them, maybe they wouldn't. But the idea that they'd be there, that felt important. He drew in a slow breath. Looking back now, I think I was still trying to be present in a world I had already decided to leave. Joe tilted his head, his voice low. And that last letter, the one you didn't name, who was it for? Keanu looked up. His expression changed. It was for someone I barely knew, he said, but who had once said something to me, something that stuck. Joe waited. We'd worked on a film years earlier. She wasn't famous. She wasn't even in front of the camera. She was a makeup artist. Quiet. Kind. He paused. There was a day on set, I was quiet, withdrawn. She noticed. I remember her handing me a cup of tea and saying, "You don't have to carry it alone." Keanu blinked slowly. She didn't press, didn't ask questions, just said it once and then walked away. His voice was soft now. It was the only time during that period I felt seen. Joe leaned back slightly, understanding the significance. So I wrote to her, Keanu said. I told her she probably didn't remember that moment, but I did. I thanked her. For the tea, for the words, for the fact that someone, even briefly, noticed the weight I was carrying. He looked at Joe again. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It was a thank you letter for something she probably didn't even realize mattered. Joe's voice returned. That moment gave you something to hold on to. Keanu nodded. For a little while, yes. But by the time I wrote the letter, I wasn't holding on to anything anymore. I just wanted to make sure she knew. He folded his hands on the table. That was the last thing I wrote. Joe's face softened. And then, Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. Then I waited. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was full of every word Keanu had never said before. Keanu's voice settled into a slow, even rhythm. Friday came like any other day, he said. The sun rose and the sky turned that soft California blue. Everything felt normal. That was the strange part. He paused, glancing downward. I woke up around 7, not because I was rested, just because my body had grown used to waking at that hour. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, counting the same 47 wooden lines I'd memorized the night before. Joe watched him quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. It wasn't a dramatic morning. It was peaceful. He shifted slightly in his chair. I got up, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window. I could see the tops of the trees swaying just slightly. No wind, just movement. He looked at Joe. That was the beginning of the goodbye. I didn't call it that at the time, but I was already saying it. To the trees. To the stillness. Joe nodded slowly. I took a walk, Keanu continued. Just around the block. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't wear sunglasses. I just wanted to see what the world looked like one last time. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. I passed the same elderly woman with the golden retriever, Margaret. She waved from her porch and I waved back. Her dog's tail wagged like always. I almost stopped to say something, but I didn't want to risk crying. So I just smiled. His voice tightened slightly. I walked past the bakery on the corner. The smell of bread reminded me of my childhood in Toronto. I looked through the window, people laughing, sipping coffee, scrolling their phones. I remember thinking how untouched they all were by the heaviness I carried. He looked at Joe again, bared the employee. It was sharp. I felt invisible, but not in a painful way, in a final way. Like a ghost watching the living. He paused. I got home around 10, took off my shoes, put them neatly by the door. I remember that detail clearly. I didn't want to leave anything messy behind. Joe didn't speak. I made toast, ate it slowly, then sat down on the couch and picked up a book I hadn't touched in months. I read 20 pages. I can't remember a single word. Keanu's hands folded together, fingers lightly touching. It wasn't about the book. It was about the act, doing something normal, something human, something that felt like life. He looked down, and then I put it away. He said nothing for a long moment. That's how the day went, quiet, simple, controlled. He nodded slowly, exactly the way I wanted it. But beneath that calm, Joe could hear what Keanu wasn't saying yet. The detachment wasn't peace. It was goodbye, dressed up like routine. Keanu took a sip of water before continuing. His voice returned, steady, but soft. In the early afternoon, I turned on a movie, he said. Something I'd seen before. I didn't want to be surprised. I didn't want anything too emotional. Joe gave a small nod, letting the silence stretch. It was a Western, Keanu added. Simple plot, a lone rider, a dusty road. It felt distant, like I was watching it through glass. He looked down, then back up again. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything. I watched it because it was something I used to enjoy. That was the test. Could I still enjoy it? He paused, and the answer was no. Joe sat back slightly, processing each word. After the movie, I took a long shower, Keanu continued. Not rushed, not mechanical, just slow. I washed my hair. I stood there and let the water hit my back. I closed my eyes and tried to feel something. Anything. His expression stayed still. But the numbness didn't lift. He folded his arms on the table gently. I brushed my hair, trimmed my beard, put on clean clothes. The black jeans, the white shirt, same outfit I'd picked earlier in the week. Keanu gave a faint nod. I even ironed the shirt. It had wrinkles, and I thought, no one wants to deal with a wrinkled shirt in this context. I know how strange that sounds now, but in that moment, it made sense. Joe's face didn't flinch. I wanted everything to look clean, organized. I didn't want anyone to feel disturbed when they walked in. I wanted them to think, he went peacefully. He exhaled slowly. There was comfort in that idea, not for me, for them. He looked up again. I sat down in the living room, No music, no lights, just the sound of the house breathing around me. Joe furrowed his brow slightly. The way the fridge would hum, then stop. The creak of wood as the sun warmed the floors. It was all so normal. But it felt like I was already gone. He drew in another breath. I looked around the room, at the furniture, the bookshelves, the framed posters from old films. It all felt distant, like a museum of someone else's life. He smiled faintly. There was a jacket on the chair, one I hadn't worn in weeks. I stood up, folded it, and put it away. Not because I planned to use it, but because I didn't want it left out. Joe's eyes softened. You were erasing your presence. Keanu nodded once. Exactly. He paused again. I wanted to leave behind a scene, not a mess. The way he said it, simple, deliberate, made the words cut deeper. Because Keanu wasn't just preparing to leave. He was curating his absence. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Keanu continued. Around 5:30 I made tea, he said. Same kind I always drank, Earl Grey. I sat by the window. I watched the golden light stretch across the floor. He looked over at Joe, and I thought, this is the last sunset I'll ever see. Joe said nothing, but his eyes said everything. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel regret. Just stillness. Like the moment had frozen. Like time had stopped. To let me take one last look. Keanu glanced down. I held the mug in my hands for over an hour, barely drank it, just let the warmth seep into my fingers. He rubbed his palms together gently, as if trying to recall the sensation. And then, at around 7, I turned off the lights in every room except the living room. I didn't want the house to feel empty. I wanted it to feel calm, like I was settling in for a quiet night. Joe sat perfectly still, his focus completely on the man across from him. I wrote one more note, Keanu said. Not to anyone in particular, just to myself. A few lines, nothing dramatic. He hesitated. It said, you did your best. You tried. It's okay to let go now. The silence that followed held its breath. I folded it, placed it under the glass of water on the table, and sat down on the couch. Keanu looked away for a moment, then back again. I looked around the room one last time. The books I never finished. The empty vase that hadn't held flowers in years. The photograph of River. The one I kept hidden behind a stack of scripts. His voice cracked slightly, and I took that photo and held it in my hands. Joe leaned in just slightly. I whispered, I'm sorry. Not to him, not just to him, to all of it. To everyone I had loved and lost. To the pieces of myself I couldn't put back together. He looked down again, and then I sat in silence. Another pause. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. The house was dark except for the light of one lamp in the corner. Everything felt finished. Joe's voice returned, soft and steady. But it wasn't. Keanu nodded slowly. No, it wasn't. His fingers tapped the edge of the table once, then stopped. Because just as I thought I was ready, something happened. He looked up at Joe with a slight shift in his expression. A sound. A noise outside the window. At first I thought it was nothing. He tilted his head, before he kept going. And just like that, the first crack formed in the silence he had built so carefully. The plan was in place. The goodbyes had been written. But life, somehow, wasn't quite done with him yet. Keanu sat motionless on the couch, his hands resting in his lap. The faint yellow light from the lamp in the corner casting soft shadows across the living room. The house was completely silent, just as he had planned. The notes were written. The arrangements were made. The end was near. And it was supposed to be quiet, clean, peaceful. Then came the sound. He tilted his head slightly, unsure if he had actually heard something or if it was just the echo of thought bouncing around the hollow silence. Then it came again. a rhythmic, dragging noise, sharp at first, followed by a soft thud. It didn't fit, not with the stillness, not with the night. Keanu sat up straighter. The sound repeated, a grind, a scrape, then a thump. Not urgent, not chaotic, just persistent. It was coming from outside. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the darkened window, wondering if it was worth checking. This night was supposed to be uninterrupted. That was part of the plan. But the sound didn't stop. Finally, he stood, walked slowly to the front window and parted the curtain just enough to see the street. And there he was, a kid, no more than 8 or 9 years old, alone on the sidewalk under the faint orange glow of the streetlight. He wore a helmet that looked slightly too big for his head and a hoodie that hung low past his hips. His sneakers were scuffed and his jeans had a tear in one knee. He was skateboarding, or trying to. Keanu stood there, watching. The boy was working on the same trick again and again. He'd roll forward slowly, then push down hard on the back of the board, trying to flip it under his feet. Every time, it slipped out, clattered to the pavement, and sent him stumbling. Scrape, thump, over and over. He never cried, never shouted, just picked up the board, walked back to the same spot, and tried again. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. It was late, well past 10. What was this kid doing out alone at this hour? And why this one trick? Why now? He kept watching. 10 tries. Then 20. The boy fell once, hard, landed on his elbow. He sat still for a moment, rubbing it gently, then stood back up, brushing gravel from his hands. He retrieved the board, nodded to himself, and went again. Scrape, thump. It was strangely hypnotic. Keanu leaned his shoulder against the window frame, arms crossed loosely in front of him. For the first time all day, his mind stopped looping. The planning, the heaviness, the goodbye. It all quieted. And all because of this kid, who didn't know he had an audience. Didn't know he was interrupting something far more dangerous than a quiet evening. And didn't care. Keanu continued to watch, the minutes stretching on without him noticing. The boy must have attempted the trick 30 or 40 times by now, maybe more. Each time, he failed. Each time, he got up, adjusted his stance, tried again. There was no music, no one filming him, no audience clapping from the sidelines. It was just the boy, his board, and a piece of sidewalk lit by a tired street lamp. Keanu's eyes stayed locked on him. There was something familiar about the motion. The falling, the persistence, the quiet determination. It reminded Keanu of being younger, of trying to learn guitar, of practicing lines in his room with no one watching, of riding a motorcycle for the first time and tipping over on gravel, embarrassed but not broken. The boy didn't look angry. He didn't even seem frustrated. He looked focused, present. Keanu glanced at the clock. It was nearing 11. He blinked, surprised at how much time had passed. For someone who had planned his hours so meticulously, this was unexpected. He hadn't planned to notice anything tonight. Certainly not this. And then it happened. The kid rolled forward again, feet steady, shoulders low. He popped the tail of the board, and for the first time, it flipped beneath him and landed back down clean. He stopped it, and in that instant, he threw his arms up in the air and let out a soft, joyful whoop. Not loud, not theatrical, just real. Pure joy. Keanu felt something shift in his chest. Not pain, not peace, something else. He didn't move. He just watched. The kid looked around as if to check if anyone had seen it, but there was no one else. No cars passing, no neighbors on porches. Just Keanu behind a window, hidden in the shadows. The boy didn't seem to mind. He nodded to himself, then bent down to pick up his board again. And that's when Keanu realized something that stopped him cold. The boy celebrated anyway. even with no one watching, even with no one to cheer or give him a high five. He had done something difficult, something meaningful to him, and he let himself feel proud, just for himself. Keanu's throat tightened. He didn't remember the last time he had felt that simple, solitary satisfaction, the kind that didn't need validation, the kind that didn't need witnesses. Just joy, for the sake of joy. He stood there another few minutes, watching the boy roll down the block, skateboard tucked under his arm, hoodie flapping in the breeze. And for the first time that day, maybe the first time in months, Keanu didn't feel like disappearing. He didn't feel healed, but he didn't feel gone. Not yet. Keanu stepped away from the window slowly, still watching as the boy vanished into the night, his silhouette swallowed by shadow. The street returned to silence. The scraping and thudding had stopped, but something in Keanu's mind was still echoing. He returned to the couch and sat down, but he didn't lean back. He didn't close his eyes. He just sat there, upright, alert, as if something had changed, but he wasn't sure what it was yet. Joe finally broke the silence. "What were you thinking in that moment?" Keanu looked at him, quiet for a beat. "I was thinking," he said, "about how that boy didn't need anyone to approve of his effort. He didn't need anyone to clap. He fell again and again, and still he smiled when he landed it." He shook his head slightly. "That felt foreign to me. The idea that you could feel pride or happiness without someone else giving it to you." Joe nodded slowly. "So what did it mean to you?" Keanu leaned back, his gaze drifting again. "It meant that I might have been wrong. About some things, about what matters, about why we stay." He laced his fingers together. "That boy didn't know I was watching. But he showed me something. He reminded me that there's value in persistence. Even when no one sees it, even when no one claps." His voice was almost a whisper. "And maybe, just maybe, that includes me." Joe said nothing. He didn't need to. Keanu exhaled deeply. "I had spent so much time measuring my worth by what I gave to others, by what I could do for people, by how well I could keep it all together. But watching that kid, I remembered what it felt like to do something just because it mattered to me." He paused. "I wasn't suddenly saved. I didn't jump up and call a therapist or tell a friend what I was feeling. But I didn't go through with the plan either." He looked directly at Joe. "I sat back down. And I stayed." Joe nodded. "That's all it takes sometimes." Keanu gave a small smile. "Yeah. One small thing, one sound, one reminder that the world is still moving, even if you feel stuck." He leaned forward slightly, and in that moment, it felt like life was tapping on the glass. Not shouting, not demanding, just gently asking if I was still there. He sat back, letting the weight of his own words settle. "I was." Joe watched him carefully, and that's when you knew something had shifted. Keanu nodded. It wasn't over, but it wasn't ending either. He looked toward the studio wall, and for the first time in a long time, I was curious about tomorrow. Keanu leaned back in his chair across from Joe, his voice quiet, but his eyes holding more light than before. "I stayed at the window longer than I realized," he said. "Long enough to forget what time it was. Long enough to forget why I was even standing there in the first place." Joe didn't speak. He knew not to interrupt now. "I think I watched him for almost 20 minutes, Keanu continued. "Maybe longer. The kid just kept going. Same movement, same trick, same rhythm, over and over." He folded his hands slowly on the table. I expected him to get frustrated, to yell, to quit. But he didn't. Every time he fell, he just picked up the board and reset his feet. Keanu looked toward the corner of the room, his eyes narrowed as if replaying the memory in real time. There was something about the way he kept trying, something honest. There was no showmanship, no posing, no one filming him for social media. It wasn't about likes or views or applause. Joe nodded gently, watching him carefully. And when he finally landed it, when he finally got the trick, He just threw his arms up and laughed. Not loud, not for attention, just that little whoop of joy. Keanu's voice softened even more. And that's what got me? Joe tilted his head slightly, letting him continue. Celebrated. And no one was there to see it. No parent, no friend, no coach, just me, hidden behind a curtain. He didn't know he had an audience, and he didn't care. He paused. A kind of joy. It was so pure. Keanu exhaled, slow and controlled. It hit me like a wave. He looked directly at Joe. I remember whispering something out loud even though no one was around to hear it. Joe's eyes narrowed with curiosity. Keanu blinked, then said, "Why can't I feel that?" He let those words hang there a moment. I wasn't asking in frustration, he explained. I was asking in wonder. That kind of happiness felt like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. He rested his hands on the table again. I used to feel that way. Not often, but I remember moments, little things. Learning a new chord, finishing a sentence in a script that just worked, laughing at something dumb with River. Joe's face remained still. But somewhere along the line, I started needing permission to be happy. I started waiting for someone else to say it was okay. Keanu looked down at the table. That kid didn't wait for anything. He just felt it, alone, in the dark, under a flickering street lamp. He paused again, then said, "And it was beautiful." Joe gave the faintest nod. "It reminded me," Keanu continued, "what joy looks like when no one's watching." And that memory had become an anchor. Keanu kept his eyes fixed on the table between them. "I went back to the couch after he disappeared down the block," he said. "I sat in the same place I'd been sitting earlier. The lamp still glowed in the corner. The letters were still where I'd left them. The plan hadn't changed." Joe nodded. "But something in me had." Keanu ran a hand slowly through his hair. "I kept thinking about that moment, that little jump, that small noise of triumph. It wouldn't leave my head, and not in a haunting way, in a humbling one." He turned toward Joe again. "I realized I had no idea what would make me feel that anymore. I couldn't even remember the last time I celebrated something privately, just for me. No press, no cameras, no fans." He paused, then smiled faintly. "Even the things I loved, movies, motorcycles, music, they'd all become part of a performance. They'd become tools to build the person everyone wanted me to be." Joe leaned forward slightly. "And you stopped being a person to yourself." Keanu looked down and nodded slowly. "Yeah, exactly." He exhaled through his nose. "That kid, he reminded me what it meant to just try for the sake of trying. To fall, to get back up, not because anyone's watching, but because you care about it." His fingers tapped lightly against the table, almost subconsciously. And for 20 minutes he gave me a glimpse of something I didn't even know I missed. Joe sat still, letting that sentence breathe. "I think we forget what that looks like," Keanu continued. "When everything becomes a performance, even healing starts to feel like something you have to prove." He looked back up at Joe, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted that feeling back. I didn't know how to get it, but I knew I wanted it." Joe's voice finally returned. "That was the shift, wasn't it?" Keanu nodded once. "It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was something close. It was possibility." He took another deep breath. "And once you've seen what joy looks like, real joy, not the kind you manufacture for a crowd, it's hard to forget it. Hard to pretend it doesn't matter." Joe's expression softened. "What did you do after that?" Keanu looked down. "Nothing. I just sat. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't write anything. I didn't move." He glanced up again. "I just let myself feel what I was feeling. Not joy, not sadness, just presence. Just being alive in that moment." Joe nodded slowly. "And that was enough?" Keanu shook his head gently. "No. but it was the first time in a long time that something felt real. He looked back toward the wall, and that was enough to keep me sitting still. Keanu's voice grew softer, but his presence never wavered. "I think about that boy a lot," he said. "Not who he was, I never saw him again. Not what he was doing, but what he showed me without ever knowing." Joe leaned in, his posture attentive. "He showed me that meaning doesn't come from applause or approval. It comes from effort, from caring enough to keep going even when no one's watching." Keanu looked down at his hands again. I had forgotten how to do that, forgotten how to move without asking permission first, how to enjoy something without wondering if it was useful. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness speak for him. I was measuring everything through the lens of pain. Is this worth the effort? Will this change anything? Does anyone care? But that kid didn't ask those questions. He opened his eyes again. You didn't need a reason. Joe spoke gently. And that challenged everything you believed at that moment. Keanu nodded. Yeah, it did. He looked across the table at Joe. I had convinced myself that if no one cared, nothing mattered. That if I disappeared, the world would keep spinning the same way. But that boy, he proved something. He paused, searching for the words. Failing. Proved that life doesn't have to be big to be beautiful. That a small moment under a streetlight can carry more meaning than 1,000 interviews or 1,000,000 likes. Joe's eyes didn't leave his, and it came exactly when you needed it. Keanu nodded again, more slowly this time. Sometimes life doesn't shout at you. It taps, it nudges, it reminds you it's still there, that you're still here. He looked down again, and for me it wasn't a therapist, or a friend, or a dramatic realization. It was a kid on a skateboard. Joe smiled softly. And that's why you stayed? Keanu nodded. Yeah, I stayed because that moment pierced something. Not deeply, not all at once, but enough to stop the momentum. Enough to make me curious again about what else might still be out there. He leaned forward slightly, and I realized something else. Joe tilted his head. I had written all those letters to say goodbye, but I hadn't written a single one to say thank you. Not to myself, not to the world, not to life. He exhaled. That boy gave me a reason to think in that direction again. Joe whispered, Did he save you? Keanu gave a quiet, steady answer. No, but he interrupted me, and sometimes that's all it takes. He folded his hands. And that interruption, that moment of unexpected beauty, it bought me time. He looked directly at Joe. Time enough for something else to happen. And just like that, a boy skating in the dark had unknowingly begun to pull a man back toward the light. Keanu sat still for a long time after the boy disappeared into the shadows of the neighborhood. The skateboard clicks had stopped, but the sound kept echoing in his mind. The whoop of joy, so small and unfiltered, refused to fade. It had touched something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in so long that he didn't recognize it at first. He hadn't moved in nearly half an hour. The letters were still on the table, the glass of water untouched, the room quiet. His mind wasn't racing anymore, but it wasn't calm either. It was something in between. He stood slowly. There was no clear reason, just the sense that he should do something, anything. He walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet. He made tea, not because he needed it, not because it was part of a plan, but because it felt like the right thing to do at that exact moment. Something simple, something warm. The small act of heating water, choosing a bag of Earl Grey and watching it steep, calmed his hands. He sat back down and cupped the mug with both hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers. The scent drifted upward, familiar and comforting. That's when a memory surfaced. It was a simple one, a golden retriever wagging its tail. He smiled without meaning to. Every morning on his rare walks, he passed the same house on the corner. The house wasn't special. White siding, blue shutters, a porch swing that barely moved. But what made it stand out was the woman who lived there. Margaret. She was always outside early, just before sunrise, sitting on a cushioned chair with a blanket around her knees. And always beside her was that dog, big, slow, happy, golden fur that caught the light. Keanu didn't know their names at first. He didn't ask. But every morning the dog would see him and jump to its feet, tail wagging furiously, ears perked, like Keanu was the most important person in the world. It made him smile, a real smile, every time. And Margaret, she would wave. Not a long wave, just a little flick of her hand, like a signal that said, "You're seen." He remembered that now. Sitting at the table with his mug of tea and his house still dim around him, he could almost feel that tail wagging against his shin, the jingle of the collar, Margaret's eyes crinkling in kindness. He had forgotten how much that meant. He'd forgotten that those seconds, 10, maybe 15, had become a kind of ritual. Something steady when everything else in his life was crumbling. A dog's joy, a woman's quiet wave. He hadn't walked past that house in over a week. He wondered if the dog still waited, if Margaret still sat out with her blanket and her tea. He took another sip. That was the first moment, however brief, he started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there were things still worth keeping. Small things, quiet things. He didn't have the answers. But now, he had a question. And that was something. Keanu looked down at the steam curling from the tea and found himself tracing the movement with his eyes. It didn't mean anything profound, but he noticed it. He was noticing again. That alone felt like a shift. He thought about Margaret again, about how she never asked questions. She never stopped him, never tried to pull him into conversation. She just offered that wave, steady as the sun rising. And the dog. Keanu remembered the first time it startled him with its happiness. He had been deep in his own thoughts, head down, and then suddenly, this tail thumping against the fence, this grin with its tongue hanging out like he was the best part of its day. The moment had disarmed him. He hadn't been able to stop himself from smiling back. At the time, he didn't realize how much it meant. Now, it hit him harder. That dog didn't know Keanu Reeves, the actor. It didn't care. It only knew the man who walked past the house every morning at the same time, and every time, without fail, it treated him like his arrival was a gift. That kind of welcome stays with you even if you try to ignore it. Keanu shifted in his seat and looked around the room again. It hadn't changed. Still the same dim light, the same silence. But now, there was something different in the air. Or maybe in him. He took another sip of tea and thought about what it would feel like to walk by that house again tomorrow morning. He pictured the dog springing up, the tail wagging, Margaret smiling, lifting her hand. What if he did that? What if he just got up, put on his shoes, and walked by again? The thought didn't come with pressure. It wasn't a command. It was an idea, one that felt strangely doable. He rested the mug on the table and leaned back. The room felt less like a tomb and more like a waiting place. There were still shadows, still grief, but there was also the quiet buzz of a new kind of awareness. The boy with the skateboard had cracked something open, and now, this memory of the dog and Margaret was widening that crack. He thought about the way the dog had looked at him, expectant, unbothered by mood or past, just glad he showed up. And Margaret. She didn't need a conversation. She just wanted to acknowledge his presence. Maybe that's all life really asks sometimes, to show up, to be seen, even by a dog, even by a stranger wrapped in a blanket on a porch. Keanu reached for the mug again. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the end. He wasn't preparing anything. He was wondering what else he had forgotten. What else still mattered that he hadn't let himself notice? It wasn't a decision yet. It wasn't a plan. but it was enough to keep him curious for one more morning. And that, in that moment, was everything. The house was silent again. The tea had gone cold in Keanu's hands, but he hadn't noticed. His thoughts drifted between the skateboard boy, Margaret and her dog, and a new question that had begun to whisper in the corners of his mind. What if there was still something left? He didn't feel hopeful, exactly, but he didn't feel finished either. The clock read 2:27 a.m. The stillness outside was deep. Even the occasional hum of a passing car had disappeared hours ago. It was the kind of silence that settles like dust, thick and undisturbed. Then he heard it. A car door closing. Sharp, quick. It didn't match the rhythm of the neighborhood. Keanu sat up, unsure if he had imagined it. Then came footsteps. Hesitant, uneven. Soft shoes on the front walk. He stood slowly and walked to the door. He didn't expect anyone. No one visited unannounced, not at this hour. He opened the door, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the figure in front of him. Slight, slouched, wearing a hoodie and jeans, holding a duffel bag loosely in one hand. Then, the face lifted under the porch light. River, his nephew, 17, messy hair, eyes red-rimmed and tired. Keanu blinked. River? The boy swallowed hard. I didn't want to be alone tonight. Those words landed harder than any scream. Keanu stepped aside without saying a word. River entered slowly, almost sheepishly, like he wasn't sure if he had made the right decision showing up. Keanu closed the door behind him. They stood in the entryway for a moment, not speaking. River looked like he'd been crying. His eyes were puffy, and his knuckles were raw, like he'd been clenching his fists too tightly for too long. Keanu reached out and took the duffel from his hand, setting it gently on the floor. I couldn't sleep, River said softly. I was lying in bed, just thinking about everything. About school, about Mom, about life. And I kept feeling like I couldn't breathe. Keanu nodded once, not to interrupt. Just to let him know he was listening. I thought maybe I'd text you, but it felt weird, so I didn't. I don't know, man. I got up, put on shoes, walked out the door. Next thing I knew, I was in a taxi. Keanu led him into the living room. The lamp still burned in the corner. The tea was untouched on the table. The letters were gone. He had tucked them into a drawer earlier without realizing why. River dropped onto the couch with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than his chest. I didn't want to be alone, he said again. That's all. I didn't know where else to go. Keanu sat down beside him, heart heavy and grateful at once. You came to the right place, he said. And he meant it. River leaned back into the couch cushions and wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. Keanu handed him a tissue from the table, and the boy gave a small nod of thanks. For a moment they sat in silence. Not the heavy kind. Not the kind that had filled the house hours earlier. This silence was different. It was shared. And in that sharing, it felt lighter. Keanu looked at him carefully. Does your mom know you're here? River shook his head. I left a note. Didn't say much, just that I needed some space. Keanu nodded, understanding more than he let on. You want to talk about what's going on? River shrugged. I don't even know, really. It's everything. School's been a mess. I'm failing math. Friends feel fake. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. I'm scared all the time, and I don't know why. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening closely. River's voice cracked. Some nights, I just feel like I don't belong anywhere. Like I'm disappointing everyone. He looked down at his hands. I don't even know why I came here. I guess I just didn't want to be alone. Keanu sat with that for a moment before answering. You don't have to explain it. I understand. River looked over, eyes glassy. You do? Keanu nodded. I've felt that way too. River blinked, surprised. You? Keanu smiled gently. Yeah, Me. The boy let out a slow breath, like he'd been holding it in all night. Whispered Keanu. I don't know what I expected you to say. Maybe to tell me to toughen up or something. Keanu shook his head. That's not what you need. River glanced around the room, his gaze settling on the half-finished mug of tea. Where are you? Up this late because you couldn't sleep either. Keanu looked at him, choosing his words carefully. Something like that. River didn't push. Maybe he sensed there was more to the story. Or maybe he just didn't have the energy to ask. I just needed to not feel alone tonight, River said again. Keanu nodded slowly. I know. They sat like that for a while, no TV, no phones. Just the two of them on a couch at nearly 3 a.m, sharing the kind of silence that didn't sting. Eventually, River leaned his head back against the cushion and closed his eyes. I think I might actually sleep now, he whispered. Keanu stood slowly and grabbed a folded blanket from the chair. He draped it over River and stood there for a while, just watching him breathe. In that moment, everything changed. The boy who had come in from the night, seeking comfort, had unknowingly brought salvation. Because Keanu realized something he hadn't seen clearly until now. River had come because he didn't want to be alone. And neither did Keanu. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them was. The blanket slipped a little off River's shoulder as he stirred awake. The living room was still dim, but a soft line of blue had begun to peek through the curtains. It was the earliest edge of sunrise, the hour when everything is silent but waiting. Keanu sat across from him, still in the armchair, a fresh cup of tea in his hands. River blinked slowly, then rubbed his eyes. What time is it? He asked, voice groggy. Almost 5, Keanu said softly. River sat up, stretching his back and arms. He looked around, surprised he had fallen asleep. I didn't mean to crash like that. Keanu smiled. You needed it. River hesitated, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Thanks for letting me come. You never have to thank me for that. River nodded, then grew quiet again. His eyes stayed on the floor. Keanu gave him space. Finally, River spoke. I've been scared a lot lately. Behind her, scared of failing, scared of not being enough. Like, everyone expects me to figure things out and I don't even know what I'm supposed to care about. Some days I feel like I'm already behind, like everyone else got some instruction manual that I missed. He exhaled slowly. I can't tell Mom. She's already stressed. And my friends? They're too busy pretending they've got everything together. Keanu's voice was steady. I know that feeling. River glanced up. You do? He nodded. I used to wake up with the same questions, even after the movies, even after the red carpets. I'd be lying in bed wondering if I was enough, wondering what it meant to be useful in the world. River stared at him like he'd just peeled back a secret door. I thought you always had it figured out. Keanu let out a breath. No one has it figured out. Some people are just better at pretending. River cracked a small, uncertain smile. I thought I was the only one faking it. You're not. They sat there in the glow of the early morning light, 2 generations of pain quietly meeting halfway. River's voice trembled. I get these moments where I think, maybe I'm broken, like something's wrong with me because everything feels so heavy. Even small things. Homework, getting up, talking to people. It feels like dragging boulders. Keanu nodded slowly. I know that weight. I've carried it. Still do sometimes. He leaned forward. There were days I couldn't get out of bed either. Not because I was tired, because I was empty. And pretending to be fine all the time, that was exhausting. River blinked fast, trying to keep tears from falling. No one ever told me adults felt this way too. Keanu's voice softened. We just get better at hiding it. They sat in that quiet for a long time, not needing to fill it with anything more. The light outside grew brighter, slipping softly through the curtains. Birds began to chirp faintly in the distance. River turned toward the window, watching the sky shift. I used to think sunrise was just another reminder I'd have to do everything all over again. Keanu followed his gaze. Yeah, he said. I used to think that too. River tilted his head. When did it change for you? Keanu didn't answer right away. He sipped his tea and thought about the night just hours before. About the skateboarder, the dog, the tea, and now River. I don't know if it ever fully changed, he said honestly, but sometimes it gets interrupted. Interrupted by something small, something honest, a moment that reminds you you're still here, that maybe it's okay to not have it all figured out. River nodded slowly. Last night was like that? For me too, Keanu replied. River hesitated. I think I wanted to disappear. Not permanently, just enough to make the pressure stop, enough to not feel like I had to be perfect. Keanu's voice was gentle. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to stay. That's enough. River wiped his eyes again. Do you think it gets better? Keanu looked at him for a long time before answering. I think it gets different. Not easier, always, but more real. You find people who understand. You find ways to make space for the pain. And eventually, the weight starts to shift. River looked down at his hands. I don't know how to do that. You don't have to know. You just have to keep showing up. The rest comes in pieces. Keanu leaned back into his chair. You came here last night because you didn't want to be alone. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Rivers smiled faintly. You really think so? I know so. The sun peeked through now in full gold, warming the tops of their faces. The room looked completely different in the light, like it had been waiting all night to show its softer side. River pulled the blanket around his shoulders. I guess I'm not the only one trying to hold it together, huh? Keanu smiled. No, you're not. They sat together in that light, no longer speaking. There was nothing more to say. Everything they had both been holding in, the fear, the pressure, the quiet ache of being human, had been named and shared. And in that sharing, neither of them felt quite so broken anymore. They had saved each other. Not with grand speeches or solutions, but with presence, with the truth, with love that didn't demand perfection. The sun kept rising, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like a beginning. The house had grown still again, but the silence no longer carried dread. It was gentle now, almost protective. River had dozed off once more on the couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket Keanu had draped over him earlier. His breathing was soft, rhythmic, almost like a child who had finally found safety after a storm. Keanu stood quietly in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, watching the boy sleep. The early light of morning stretched across the hardwood floor, spilling across River's sneakers and the edge of the couch. Something about the image stopped Keanu where he stood. This wasn't a moment he had planned, not even close. Just hours ago, this living room had felt like a tomb. Now, with one unexpected knock at the door, everything had shifted. Not magically, not dramatically, but undeniably. Keanu turned, walked to the side table in the hallway, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a book and a folded photograph of his sister and Ava, were the 3 goodbye letters. He picked them up one at a time. Each envelope felt heavier than it should have. He held the one addressed to Kim first. His sister had always been his closest anchor. The thought of her finding that letter, reading it, wondering what she missed, made something twist sharply in his chest. The next one was for his mother. He'd kept that one short. She'd been through enough. He had told himself sparing her details would be a kindness, though he wasn't sure if that was really true. Then came the third. No name on the outside. Just a letter folded inside that held the words he hadn't been able to say out loud to anyone. Not for years. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He stood there for a moment, letters in hand, then walked to the fireplace. The cold ashes from weeks ago still sat undisturbed in the grate. He knelt slowly, placed the 3 letters on the iron rack, and reached for the box of matches tucked in the nearby drawer. His hand trembled slightly as he struck the match. The flame caught quickly, first on Kim's letter, then his mother's, finally the 3rd. The paper curled, darkened, then crumbled into soft black flakes. The heat warmed his face, but it was the smell, the faint scent of burning ink and old regret, that brought tears to his eyes. He watched until every word he had written had vanished. The silence returned, not hollow, but clean. He sat back on the floor, arms resting on his knees, staring into the soft orange glow. And that's when the thought came, as clear as anything he'd ever known. I can't go. Not now. Not while someone still needs me. Not while River is still trying to figure out how to breathe. Not while he's searching for something to hold on to. Keanu looked over his shoulder at the boy on the couch. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and his head had tilted gently to one side. The reason wasn't abstract anymore. It had a name. It had a face. It had just knocked on his door at 2 a.m. with trembling hands and tearful eyes. And now, it was asleep in his living room. The fire in the hearth had begun to fade, its glow turning to soft embers. Keanu sat quietly on the floor, staring into what remained of the letters. There was no sense of drama, no cinematic finality, just peace, quiet, grounded peace. And something else. Decision. He stood up slowly, knees stiff from the stillness, and made his way back into the kitchen. He poured the last of the tea into a fresh mug and took a slow sip, not because he needed the warmth, but because he needed the motion. The act of continuing. River stirred behind him. Keanu glanced over his shoulder and saw the boy shifting beneath the blanket, half awake. "I burned them," Keanu said softly. River blinked, eyes barely open. "Burned what?" Keanu turned around. "The letters." River sat up straighter now, confused. "What letters?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He sat across from him again and rested the mug on his knee. "I wrote goodbye letters," he said. River's face paled. "You were..." Keanu raised a hand, gently. "I was. But not anymore." River swallowed hard. "Well..." Keanu looked him in the eyes. "Because last night someone came to my door and reminded me that I still matter." River looked down, overwhelmed. "You mean me?" "Yes." A long silence followed. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. As if both of them were standing at the edge of something enormous, and neither one quite knew how to speak yet. River exhaled shakily. "I didn't know." "You didn't have to." Keanu paused, choosing his next words with care. "I had convinced myself that the world would keep spinning without me, that I wasn't holding anything up, that I was... disposable?" River shook his head. "You're not. I know that now." Keanu reached over and rested a hand on River's shoulder. "You gave me that. Just by being honest. Just by showing up." River blinked away a fresh wave of tears. Keanu continued. "There's something powerful in being needed. Not for what you can do, but just for who you are." River nodded slowly. "I needed someone last night. I didn't even know what I needed. I just knew it wasn't solitude." "You weren't alone," Keanu said. "Neither was I." They both sat with that. The early morning had given way to full light now. The room was awash in soft gold. Birds chirped louder outside. Life was moving again. Keanu stood up and stretched. "I'm going to make breakfast," he said. "You hungry?" River smiled through tired eyes. "Starving." Keanu moved toward the kitchen with a lightness he hadn't felt in months. Not joy exactly, but something deeper, something like clarity. He opened the fridge, took out eggs, and cracked them into a bowl. The decision had already been made. He wasn't leaving. Not today. Not while someone still needed him. Maybe that was enough. The morning after the letters burned felt different. Keanu wasn't sure if it was the sunlight creeping through the blinds or the faint smell of eggs still hanging in the kitchen, but something had shifted. There was no grand epiphany, no trumpet of joy, just a sense that maybe he could start again. River was still asleep in the guest room. Keanu had left the door cracked open. That small detail meant something now. It meant trust. It meant he hoped River felt safe enough to stay. Keanu stood barefoot in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, one black, one with the handle chipped. He placed both on the table, just in case. Then he turned to the stove and started frying up some bacon. The sizzle filled the quiet, and for once, the silence didn't weigh him down. It felt like space, breathing room. River appeared about 15 minutes later, his hair messy, hoodie wrinkled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You made coffee?" he asked, surprised. Keanu nodded. "And bacon, sit." They ate in near silence at first, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward anymore, just familiar. After a few bites, River said, "I think I'm going to stay a few days, if that's okay." Keanu didn't hesitate. "It's more than okay." Those few days turned into 3 weeks. 3 weeks of slow healing. 3 weeks of small routines that didn't feel small at all. They went on morning walks, nothing strenuous, just around the block, sometimes to the local park. Keanu began noticing things he'd ignored for months. The way the wind moved through the leaves, the sound of dogs barking 2 streets over, the neighbor's cat who always stared at them like it was guarding some ancient secret. They started cooking together. River wasn't a great cook, but he was willing, and that was enough. Pancakes, grilled cheese, spaghetti, even an apple pie that nearly set the oven off. They laughed more than they talked during those attempts, but the kitchen filled with a kind of joy Keanu hadn't felt since he was a teenager. Some nights they'd stay up watching old movies. River had never seen Rebel Without a Cause. Keanu smiled to himself, thinking of River Phoenix. Bittersweet, but even that pain had started to lose its sharpness. Not gone, just softened by time, and now, presence. One morning, Keanu pulled out an old vinyl record player from storage. He hadn't touched it in years. He and River sat cross-legged on the floor as a scratched-up Beatles record played through the speakers. River said, "This is actually kind of awesome." Keanu chuckled. "Told you." There was no breakthrough moment, no single sunrise that changed everything. It was the layering of simple mornings, one on top of the other, no longer surviving, but actually living. Keanu found himself humming again, sometimes singing in the shower. He started answering texts, not all of them, but enough. He returned a call from his sister Kim, and they spoke for over an hour. She didn't mention anything serious, just caught him up on little things. Her voice made him realize how long he'd been drifting. That evening, he sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea and whispered, "I think I want to stay. Not just stay alive, but stay present, stay open, stay awake." He wasn't healed, not completely, but he had begun, and that beginning, however quiet, was everything. The days passed gently, each one offering something new, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts that mattered deeply. Keanu began waking up before the alarm, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The morning light filtering through the curtains felt like an invitation instead of a burden. One morning, he found River sitting in the backyard with a notebook. The boy had been sketching the trees, just lines and shadows. Keanu watched quietly from the kitchen for a moment before stepping outside. "You draw?" he asked. River looked up, shrugged. "Not really. Just helps me focus." Keanu sat next to him on the porch steps. "Looks good?" They didn't talk much after that, just sat, and that was enough. By the end of the first week, Keanu had started doing something he hadn't done in months: answering fan mail. He'd kept the letters in a box by his front door, For a long time, he couldn't even look at them. But now he pulled out a few, read them slowly, and replied. One letter from a young man in Kentucky said that Keanu's films helped him survive depression. Another from a single mother thanked him for being a quiet light. He found himself wiping away tears more often, not because he was broken, but because something inside him was waking up. On a rainy Wednesday, he and River baked cookies. Neither of them knew what they were doing. The dough was too sticky, the oven too hot. But when they finally tasted one that wasn't burnt, they looked at each other and burst into laughter. River said, "We're actually terrible at this." Keanu smiled. "Terrible's a start." Later that night, Keanu pulled out an old journal. The pages were yellowed at the edges, the spine cracked. He hadn't written in it since Ava. But something told him it was time. He started slow, just a few lines. Things like, "Today I noticed the air smelled like pine," or "River smiles like Kim used to when she was 12. Small observations, gentle truths. It was a way of anchoring himself again, of remembering. Music returned to the house too. River liked to play ambient soundtracks while doing homework. Keanu started building playlists again, like he used to in his 20s. He played Leonard Cohen, Jeff Buckley, Tracy Chapman. The songs weren't just background anymore. They were threads, binding memories, moods, mornings. On the second Sunday, they walked to the neighborhood bookstore. Keanu hadn't been there in over a year. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, lit up when he saw him. "You're back," the man said. Keanu simply nodded. "Yeah, I'm back." He bought 2 books, one on meditation and one on grief. River picked out a fantasy novel and a graphic memoir about surviving high school. On the walk home, they talked about stories. How everyone carries one, how the hardest ones are the ones never told. That night, as Keanu lay in bed, he realized something quietly profound. He was beginning to look forward to things again. Not career milestones or grand adventures. Just simple things, like the taste of fresh toast, the sound of River's footsteps down the hallway, the rustle of leaves outside his window before the rain. For the first time in a year, Keanu didn't feel like he was pretending to live. He was living. Not every moment was easy. Some nights were still heavy, but he had a routine now, a rhythm, a reason. He whispered a quiet thank you into the dark, not to anyone in particular, just, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to see this morning." And with that, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest. Because tomorrow, he'd make breakfast again. And that was enough. It started quietly, like most things that matter. A few months after River returned home, Keanu got a call from his sister. She told him River had signed up for a local mentoring program at his high school. Nothing formal at first, just helping freshmen adjust, listening to kids who had no one else. Keanu wasn't surprised. That night in his living room, the one River arrived without warning had planted a seed in both of them. River had come looking for safety, but what neither of them expected was how that moment of desperation would shape a new calling. River began spending more time volunteering. He helped with peer support groups, sat with kids during lunch who usually ate alone, talked kids through panic attacks. Some days, he came home exhausted, but there was always a glow in his eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. One Saturday afternoon, Keanu visited the community center where River was helping out. It was nothing glamorous, just a simple room with foldable chairs, lukewarm coffee, and a whiteboard filled with scribbles. But what he saw humbled him. River sat in a circle with 7 teenagers, each of them sharing something personal. One girl spoke about losing her dad. Another boy admitted he was scared of being forgotten. River didn't interrupt. He just nodded, listened, and asked the softest questions when needed. Keanu stood in the back, hands in his pockets, and for a few minutes, he forgot about everything else. This, he realized, was what healing looked like. Not grand speeches or perfect answers, just presence. Later that night, as they drove home in silence, Keanu finally said, "You're good at that." River looked over. "Good at what?" "Being there for people." Rivers smiled a little. "It helps me too." Keanu nodded. He understood now. Pain, when shared, becomes something else. Not lighter necessarily, but less lonely. As weeks turned into seasons, Rivers' role deepened. He started training to become a licensed counselor, took night classes, read everything he could find about trauma, resilience, and the psychology of grief. He wasn't chasing a career. He was answering a pull, a need, the kind that doesn't leave you alone once it calls your name. Meanwhile, Keanu found himself changing too. He started noticing things in conversations that used to pass him by. The way someone paused before answering, the sudden drop in tone, the long silences between sentences. These were the places people hid their sorrow. He began checking in with friends more often, not just through text. He'd call, show up, bring tea, or walk with them. He stopped waiting for people to say they were struggling. He started listening for what they didn't say. One afternoon, he ran into an old co-star at a film event. They smiled for photos, exchanged pleasantries, but something in her eyes was off. After the cameras faded, Keanu asked, "You okay?" She hesitated, then said she was fine. He waited, then softly said, "You don't have to be." And just like that, she broke down. Right there, in the hallway behind the velvet ropes, Keanu held her as she cried, and afterward she whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." That moment stayed with him, because it wasn't about fixing anyone. It was about witnessing, holding space, and that, he realized, was something he could do. There were other moments like that, quiet conversations that unfolded in unexpected places. A security guard who admitted his daughter had stopped speaking to him. A makeup artist who hadn't slept in 2 nights because of anxiety. A young fan who just needed someone to say, "I hear you." Keanu didn't try to give advice. He didn't have all the answers. But what he did have was attention, a kind of stillness, the kind that makes people feel safe enough to tell the truth. He started keeping a journal again, though not like before. Instead of writing about himself, he wrote about moments, noticing a barista who looked like she'd been crying, a man on the subway with shaking hands, a neighbor who watered his plants too early in the morning, like sleep had long abandoned him. He never judged, just recorded, and when he felt strong enough, he acted. Sometimes that meant leaving a note. Sometimes it meant calling someone at midnight. Sometimes it meant just sitting with someone for an hour, no words needed. That old question Joe Rogan had asked, "How do you keep going after everything?" no longer felt like a weight, it felt like a doorway. Because the answer wasn't about strength, it was about connection. River continued his path. Years later, he opened a youth center with 2 other counselors. It wasn't big, just 4 rooms, a small garden, and a hallway filled with hand-painted artwork from the kids. But it became a lighthouse, a place for those lost in their own storms. At the ribbon cutting, River gave a short speech, nothing grand, just a few sentences. He said, "This place exists because someone answered the door when I showed up uninvited. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just let me sit with him. That night saved my life. And now I want to pass that on." Keanu stood in the back of the crowd, his hands clasped, his heart full. He didn't need credit. He didn't want recognition. He just watched River speak, and in that moment, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Later that night, back at home, Keanu made tea and stood by the window. The street outside was quiet. No skateboarder this time, just wind rustling through the trees. He thought about all the people who had saved him without knowing it. The boy who kept falling and getting back up. The dog who wagged its tail every morning like it had waited all night just to see him. River's voice breaking through the silence with, "I didn't want to be alone tonight." All of it mattered. All of it had rippled outward. Keanu didn't consider himself healed. That word felt too final, too neat. But he was learning, living with softness, staying open. And now, when someone asked him how he kept going, he had an answer. "I listen," he would say. "I listen for what people..." Because sometimes, that's where the truth lives. And sometimes just hearing it, just being there, is enough to save a life. The studio felt still again. Joe leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, his voice quieter than before. "Do you think that night saved your life?" Keanu didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped softly against the edge of his cup. Then he looked up, not at Joe, but just past him, as if seeing something in the air between memory and presence. "No," he said softly. "Not the night. River did. That skateboard kid did. The dog. The old woman with the soft smile and the quiet voice. They all did." Joe didn't interrupt. He just nodded, letting the words hang where they needed to. Keanu continued, his voice low but steady. "I used to think if someone could just say the perfect thing at the perfect time, it would fix everything. But it's not like that. It's not one thing, it's not one moment. It's 1,000 tiny choices, quiet interventions, people showing up without knowing they're showing up." He paused and let out a slow breath. It wasn't some grand epiphany. It was a kid falling off a skateboard and getting back up. It was River knocking on my door because he didn't want to be alone. It was me realizing that I wasn't either. The air in the room shifted. Even the sound engineer behind the glass seemed to hold his breath. Keanu ran his hand over his chin and looked down. "I don't know if I'll ever be the version of me I thought I'd become. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is choosing to stay, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Joe's eyes were steady. "Do you still struggle?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I do. Some mornings it's still hard to get out of bed, not because I'm lazy or tired, but because I'm afraid of the silence, afraid I'll slip back into it." He tilted his head slightly. "But now, when that feeling comes, I don't try to outrun it. I sit with it. I breathe through it, and then I call someone. Or I walk outside, or I make tea, or I remember that somewhere some kid is trying a trick for the 20th time, and they're not giving up." A half smile tugged at his lips. "That's enough, not always to feel happy, but to keep going." Joe leaned back in his chair. "That's a different kind of strength." Keanu nodded. "The kind that doesn't look like strength, the kind that just keeps showing up." He looked over then, directly into Joe's eyes. "And the weird part? All those things that saved me, none of them knew they were doing it. That boy skating under a broken streetlight, that woman who smiled as her dog wagged its tail, they were just living their lives. But they were sending out something, a kind of invisible kindness." His voice dropped almost to a whisper, and I caught it. Joe waited a moment, then asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if River hadn't shown up that night?" Keanu looked down. "All the time," he said, his fingers curled slightly, resting on the edge of the table. "I think about how close I came, not out of shame, but out of clarity. That moment could have been the end, but instead, it became the beginning of something else." He breathed deeply, then continued. "River showing up wasn't just luck. It was timing. It was the universe nudging both of us at the same time, across miles of silence. That night didn't save me. Connection did. That night was just the container." Keanu glanced toward the camera, though his gaze wasn't meant for the audience. It was more like a message to the world. I think we need to stop waiting for big miracles, he said. Sometimes the miracle is just staying long enough to see one. Joe leaned in. You said earlier that it's not one moment, but a collection. How do you recognize those now? Keanu gave a soft chuckle. You don't. Not always. That's the thing. Most of them pass you by and you don't realize what they were until much later. But when you slow down, when you stop trying to control the noise, you begin to notice things. He nodded to himself. Now I try to listen more. Not just to what people say, but to what they don't. The silence in someone's voice, the way they deflect compliments, the laugh that feels a little forced, the text message that says, I'm fine, when they really mean, I don't know how to ask for help. Joe let out a breath. Man, that's real. Keanu smiled. It's not profound, but it's real, and that's enough. He tapped the table softly, not as a drumbeat, but as if grounding himself in the moment. I've learned that you don't have to fix people. You just have to sit with them long enough for them to remember they're not alone. The room settled into a pause again, a peaceful kind of quiet. Joe finally said, if someone's listening right now and they're on the edge, what would you say to them? Keanu didn't answer right away. Then he looked up, and his eyes were clear. I'd say this, he began. I know the pain feels permanent. I know it whispers things that sound like truth. But it's lying, not because you're weak, but because you're human. And pain, it narrows the world. It tells you no one would notice if you left, but someone would. Someone already does. Even if they don't know how to say it. He exhaled slowly. I'd say stay. Not for the big moments, but for the small ones. A hot cup of coffee, the sound of rain, a friend showing up at your door at 2:30 a.m. Stay for that. He looked down, then added softly, and if you can't stay for you, stay for someone else. Just for now. That's how it started for me, and somehow that became enough. Joe's voice was quiet now. That might be the most important thing anyone's ever said on this show. Keanu shook his head gently. It's just what I needed to hear once, so I'm passing it on. And with that, the space between them was filled with something rare, not just understanding, but presence. Keanu sat in silence for a moment after the cameras had stopped rolling. The lights above dimmed slightly, and something about the quiet felt different now, softer. More awake. Then he turned toward the audience, his voice gentle but steady. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like there's no way forward, I want you to know, I've been there. He paused. I don't say that lightly. I'm not offering you a line. I'm offering you the truth. I've been in that dark room, the one where the walls seem to close in and the silence grows teeth. His eyes lowered for a moment before lifting again, filled with something deeper than just sincerity. A quiet ache, softened by understanding. You might think you're a burden, that people are better off without your pain, that your presence is small, invisible, unnecessary. I thought that too. A slow breath filled the space. But what I didn't understand back then is how many people were quietly holding on to my presence, not because I was a movie star, not because I had answers, but because I existed, because I listened, because I smiled at them on the street or picked up the phone when I didn't feel like talking. Keanu leaned in slightly. We forget that the little things matter, a smile, a kind word, showing up, staying a few minutes longer. These are not small things. These are lifelines. His voice deepened just slightly. If you are struggling, I'm not here to tell you to be strong or just hold on. I'm here to tell you that reaching out is not weakness, it's wisdom. Reaching out isn't just for your sake. Sometimes, the very act of saying, I need help, gives someone else permission to do the same. He paused again, allowing those words to settle. Sometimes, saving someone else is how we end up saving ourselves. He nodded softly. I didn't know that until River knocked on my door. until I saw a kid fall and get back up for no one but himself, until an old woman smiled at me with no agenda. These people saved me. Not with speeches, not with therapy, not with grand gestures, but with presence. He let that word sit. Presence. That's all most people want. Not perfection, not solutions, just to know they're not alone. Keanu's hands rested on his knees now, his body relaxed in a way that spoke of peace, hard-earned, not easily given. I've spent years rebuilding, from the inside out, and I'm still rebuilding, but I'm no longer building alone. I've learned to reach back, to check in, to ask people questions that can't be answered with, "I'm fine." He smiled faintly. Sometimes people don't say what they're really feeling, so now I listen for what they don't say. He looked up, this time directly into the camera lens. If you're out there watching, and something in this story stirred something inside you, please don't ignore it. Let it move you. Let it take you 1 inch closer to someone else. Keanu leaned back, his gaze steady, as if he were seeing every viewer on the other side of the screen. I don't know your story. I don't know what you're carrying, but I do know this. You matter more than you know. He let the words sit there, unhurried, certain. Maybe no one's told you lately. Maybe no one's noticed the quiet ways you keep showing up. For your family, for your job, for strangers who'll never thank you. Maybe you think no one would miss you if you disappeared. He shook his head, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. You're wrong. He leaned forward slightly. I know how convincing that voice in your head can be. The one that says, you're too broken, too late, too tired. But there's another voice. It's quieter. It's patient. And it says, stay. His hands rested loosely in his lap. His shoulders relaxed, as if the weight of his words was grounding him instead of burdening him. You're not a project to be fixed. You're a person to be loved. He paused, letting those words resonate. And even if you don't believe that right now, that's okay. Just don't leave before you find out what happens next. A long, steady breath. Let someone in, even if it's awkward, even if you don't know what to say. Let someone know that you're not okay. It might feel like weakness, but it's one of the bravest things you'll ever do. Keanu's eyes glistened, but his voice didn't waver. If my story means anything, let it be this. You don't need to have it all figured out. You just need to stay. One more day, one more hour, one more breath. He smiled again, but this time it carried warmth, not pain. There are people out there you haven't met yet who will be so grateful you lived. People you'll make laugh. People you'll help without realizing it. People who'll say one day, I don't know what I would have done without them. You just don't know it yet. He leaned forward, almost like he was passing along a secret. You are not alone, even when it feels like it, especially then. Then, gently, as if delivering a gift. If you're still here, I'm proud of you. He sat quietly for a beat. And if a small moment ever saved you, something someone said, something someone did, even something as simple as a stranger's kindness, I want you to share it below. He looked directly into the camera again. You never know who's reading. Your story might be the thing that saves someone else. A soft smile crept onto his face. This isn't about being famous. It's not about being strong. It's about being human. And remembering that being human means being connected. He nodded once, quietly, meaningfully. So comment below. Tell us, has a small moment ever saved you? Then, with one last glance, filled not with drama, but with quiet sincerity, Keanu said, stay, and the screen faded to black.